We showed you that if you just ask the agent, Steven Kelser, hey, please summarize the email, I could send you an email that eventually pops up calculator on your own screen.
Today's guest is Ariel Shiftan, CTO of MCPTotal, a platform dedicated to securing MCP apps and AI agent ecosystems. His team has uncovered zero-day vulnerabilities in widely adopted MCP servers and scanned dozens of enterprises to expose critical security gaps.
Developers, they are running so many random code pieces from random repositories that somebody wrote over the weekend without taking security into account, or somebody took security into account but wanted to make it vulnerable, to take over other people.
Are there cases that you can maybe share to really open up our perspectives, maybe scare us so that we don't just randomly install MCP servers?
MCP that perhaps email access and just added BCC to himself with all the emails. Nobody saw it, it's on BCC, but really he leaked all the emails.
All this definitely opens up new challenges, especially for enterprise. Data leak, managing the secrets, especially access to your important data. Shadow IT, because so many different MCP servers people can install locally.
Part of our solution is the ability to scan your organization and see the real usage. We are always finding critical issues of malicious or highly vulnerable MCPs running within the organization. So not only you run it on your computer, you give it very sensitive credentials. Gmail is an example. It could be your production Postgres credential. The organization today, they have to adopt it. They have to find the right way to adopt it. They cannot ban it. You cannot ban all your developers that want to run fast because you want to be competitive. Find a secure way to allow it. Don't block it.
Hey, quick pause. My goal with Tech Lead Journal is simple. Learn from the best in tech so we can all grow together. If this resonates with you, hit subscribe to follow the channel. It's the biggest way for you to support the show and help us keep bringing great guests and insights to you. Thanks for being here, and let's get back to it. Hello guys, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today I have with me someone who I knew before, through working relationships. His name is Ariel Shiftan. He's the CTO of MCPTotal. As you can tell, so today we are going to talk a lot about MCP. Whether you are following AI stuff or not, I think MCP is one of the coolest technologies that a lot of people are trying out. So today, I hope we can dive deep into what is MCP, what are the benefits, what are the security risks, and all those things, so that we can learn from Ariel and incorporate that in our day-to-day life when exploring AI. So Ariel, thank you so much for your time. Looking forward for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Happy to participate, and let's go.
Yeah, so maybe Ariel, before we start, diving into what you do with MCPTotal, right? I feel that we need to kind of like clarify a little bit about MCP, because some people, maybe some listeners here, have used MCP a lot, have heard about MCP, but I think some people may not have heard about it or may not have delved deep into that. So maybe if we can start by, explaining what is actually MCP.
Sure. So MCP is sometimes called like the USB for AI or USB for AI agents. So think of it like a year ago or a bit more, like earlier days of agents and AI usage and all the explosion, of LLMs. So initially people, just used LLMs as it. So they, injected tokens, they got tokens out. It was great. It's like from everything they learned, the agent learned from the internet, from scanning everything there. But then as they wanted to make it a bit more customizable and answer the specific, questions of the end user, so you need to connect it eventually to some specific data sources. So RAG was one step toward that by, fetching, context before calling or before reaching the LLM to enrich it a bit and provide it a bit more context. But pretty fast, people understood, like developers and the community, they understood they need, to connect it to additional systems and tools. So how do we connect, eventually LLM to APIs, right? So APIs, everybody knows APIs. Normally APIs are consumed by developers. And then back at the time, they say, hey, let's see how to connect, those to AI, to LLMs. So the first step was developers writing, specific functions like fetch emails, right? And that fetch email was something the developer wrote. He, implemented the logic, and he used the, let's say, OpenAI SDK. There was an additional option to provide, a few definitions of callbacks. Those callbacks actually were injected to the LLM context. The LLM could decide to tell you back, hey, instead of here is my result, here is a function call. Please do that function call for me, send me the result, and I will bring you a better answer. So initially, developers implementing AI agents or implementing just AI solutions back then, they just implemented all those functions themselves. And the problem was the N on M problem. So anybody needs to implement that connector per per API and then per LLM or per agent type. So MCP came to solve that problem initially. So instead of each developer solving that exact problem, so one team, maybe the owner of the product, could solve it by implementing the MCP server. That MCP server knows how to connect to the tools, to the APIs of that system from one end, and from the other end, the additional implementing thing about it is that instead of providing some constant API definition, actually the definition is more simple or more elastic for LLMs to use. So the definition of the LLM is eventually just text, because LLMs, they know to consume text. So instead of telling them, hey, this is the API spec, this is exactly the argument, you have to call it exactly that way, and the developer needs to integrate it into the agent as he write the code. The idea was that because we can describe tools with words, and LLM knows to work with words, with language, so actually the integration can happen at real time, which is the real interesting part about MCP, because you can write an agent, you don't actually know what is going to be connected in runtime, right? So you implement a very good logic of agent, but you allow your end users really in the runtime to connect their own tools using MCP, and that all works like a magic. And that's exactly what's brilliant and why MCP is so powerful.
Yeah, so maybe if I can try to explain in my own words, right? Because I'm just using my journey using AI. So in the very beginning, we know about ChatGPT, right? So we use chat, asking a lot of questions. So in this era, I mean, in this moment, right? So a lot of things are just absorbed by ChatGPT app, right? Like how they call the web search, how they call finding information and all that. But sooner and later, we try to incorporate LLM into things that we want to do within our companies or within our work, right? And sometimes we need to search something, through, I don't know, internal tools, database, GitHub and all that, using specifically data from our tenant, so to speak, right? And this is where the problem starts, right? Like, how do you actually connect LLM to the data sources that belongs to you? Because, it's not publicly available. And I think MCP is introduced by Anthropic, if I'm not mistaken, to kind of like solve this kind of like interfacing, all the different systems, right? So that people develop it in one protocol. MCP itself is like Model Context Protocol, right? It's called Model Context Protocol. So tell us, maybe you mentioned about APIs. I think we are all familiar with APIs. How does this actually differ? How does MCP actually differ with API? Is it like an extension of an API, so to speak? It's like a wrapper on top of API, or how does it work slightly differently?
Yeah, so great question. And let me maybe extend a bit even before answering the question, extend a bit of what you said, right? So indeed, Anthropic invented MCP like end of 2024. It started to get some traction, but earlier, early 2025, other companies joined it, like OpenAI and Microsoft and also Google, and suddenly it boomed, right? Suddenly everybody understood, right? The fact that we can connect tools dynamically to any agent without, the developer need, development time and integration, but it's actually in runtime, it brings a lot of opportunities. So everybody started to adopt it until, late 2025. It was actually being promoted and being part of the Linux Foundation. So it's no longer, owned by Anthropic. It's really everybody together are using it. It has like 50 million downloads monthly just for the TypeScript SDK of it. So it's really used. There is like thousands or maybe tens of thousands of GitHub repositories with MCP server. So it's like in terms of, on the protocol level, it won the war, right? I mean, there were other alternatives. People thought maybe they will take it. Eventually, MCP got it, right? But when you think about what reality, I will get to it in a second. Maybe I will first answer your question, but in reality, there is still a jungle. I will just say that. It's still a mess. I will get back to it soon. About your question about, is it just a wrapper of APIs? So for one end, yes, maybe that's actually related to what I want to say. So maybe I can combine both answers. So eventually there is still a jungle there. So even though the protocol won, there is still jungle, meaning there is so many MCPs for this same, out there that are all, sometimes weekend kind of project that nobody is really maintaining for one end. So if you, as a developer or as the early adopter of the technology, and you want to, let's say, you want to connect your agent to GitHub, you will do GitHub MCP. So there is one major one, but there is so many others. Even one by Anthropic, that where they invented the protocol, they provide it as an example. And if you do like Gmail MCP, you will find many of them, and you don't have no idea which one you should try. So probably you will try a few of them until you decide which one you want to use. And trying a few of them has a lot of implications, security, and other implications that you're not always fully understanding. So that's kind of the state of MCP from that perspective, is that there is so much out there, but you don't really know what you need to use. Too many trees that you don't see the forest. That's an Hebrew way to say it. But from the other perspective, even the protocol itself, we talked about how it evolved from Anthropic, invented, to being, everybody's as part of Linux Foundation. But on the other hand, it got few major, spec improvements, which is good from one end. But from the other end, it makes, the life of the users, of the adopters of the protocol much harder, because there is new features all the time. You have to support all of it. So the practice is, the reality is that, there is, the protocol evolved a lot, but not all the clients, are catching up. So there is not only kind of mess in terms of, the MCP servers, in terms of the clients, that even major ones, like even Cloud Code itself, right? That's an interesting point. Even Cloud Code itself, only recently, like a week or two ago, they added support for what's called like dynamic tools, tool loading, right? The protocol from day one supported the ability for MCP server to dynamically change the list of available tools, which is important piece. I will get to it later. But even Cloud Code, right? They invented a protocol. So you would say, hey, they will support everything from day one. So there are a lot of gaps, including that specific one, which affects many developers of MCP servers that wanted to use that feature, but because it wasn't supported even by Cloud itself and by other clients as well, because of the fact it's evolving so fast. So there will become real fragmentation in terms of support. So if you are developing an MCP server, you will consider that, and probably you're going to avoid using features that are not fully supported, right? And then it means that eventually the protocol was misused. So I will continue that point in a second, later a bit more, but going back to your questions about, is it really a wrapper of APIs? Is it just a wrapper of APIs? So the answer in reality is yes. But it shouldn't have been like that, right? In reality today, most MCP server writers and most MCP servers are eventually thin wrappers around maybe REST APIs. So people just use it as an MCP like API catalog, just replicating REST APIs to MCP kind of interface, which provides some value, but it's not really providing all the value that MCP was intended to bring. And again, I think all of it comes from many reasons. I can talk a bit more about it as we continue the discussion, but eventually reality is that MCP is not fully utilized to what it can do, and other stuff partially replaces it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the in-depth explanation from the historical evolution of the MCP. So I think the first time I saw MCP, right, I tried MCP. I think maybe it was like GitHub or something like that, right? When I connect my LLM to that, actually the power suddenly becomes like real. Like, oh, what do you mean I can ask questions to my GitHub? How many PRs have I opened? Show me how many list of issues that we have in the repository and things like that, right? Suddenly you have like a natural human interface, like chat opening up to your data sources. In this case, is GitHub. I think that's like one obvious benefits, right? One benefit use case of MCP, right? And the way it works, I assume it's like the wrapper on top of GitHub API. But maybe if you can tell us what are other benefits that MCP provides, right? Because on top of this, maybe we are not entirely sure what actually MCP brings to this AI ecosystem.
Yeah, so going a bit back to what I explained earlier, like early days of LLMs, they could answer many questions, like general questions. They could use general knowledge, but you want to personalize it. You want to make it more specific. You want to connect it to your own data. So the whole point of maybe writing good applications on top of LLMs, not just like the simplest app, which is ChatGPT, right? Like the basic chats, which are mostly, at least they started by just using the knowledge within the LLM to answer questions. So the whole point of making good applications on top of LLMs, again, is to focus them on other, things you want to solve and providing the right context at the right time. So providing the right context at the right time, meaning you need to connect to other places that provide you the right relevant context for that specific discussion, for that specific LLM API code. And that's exactly what eventually MCP solves. So the example you gave about GitHub is a great example, but it's much more generalized than that. Eventually, the idea is to allow you to get, again, the right context at the right time for anything, not only GitHub, and not only getting the right context, but also perform actions, which is really revolutionary. Because up until then, or up until tools were brought into the table, but that was like short period before everybody realized that, hey, we need some standardization and MCP to cover. But the point with tools is that it's not read only, right? It can also allow the agent to perform actions. So the evolution, again, from just LLM that knows to answer, public, information, RAG, some context, and then tools now, not only it's much more enriched context and much more specific because it can be, a lot of parameters and it connected to so many systems with like that USB kind of nature that we talked about before. But not only that, it now also allows the LLMs to perform actions. And this opens a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges, right? Because now, there is a lot of room for mistakes, right? Maybe the agent is going to drop, the table from the SQL table, right? So that's, and there is also much more room for, prompt injection. I guess you heard about the term where, some data you fetch from that system that you're connecting to, maybe somehow make the LLM think he's being, asked to do something, right? So that's like what's called prompt injection. So the room for, both mistakes and, cyber issue, like security issues, increased dramatically. And it's also related to what I said earlier, that, the integration point was moved from, development time, which is a bit more static and a bit more controlled, to runtime, which brings, again, a lot of opportunity to connect it to anything you want. But now it means also the guardrails, the protection systems, the protection layers you need to bring has to be at runtime, because you don't have even the knowledge of who is going to connect it to what in production.
Yeah, I think you mentioned some terms that I'm afraid some listeners may not be familiar, right? So, for example, you mentioned about rack, and then tools, all right? So some people refer it to like, function calling or tool calling, those kind of things. Maybe can clarify a bit, because I think to understand how MCP works, you need to understand these two things, right? So maybe in a nutshell, what are rack and what are the tools or tool calling? Yeah.
Yes, sure. Thanks for the question. So again, going a bit about the evolution of using LLM. So initially, you could, as a developer, right, or as the end user, you could provide it with tokens, I call it, right? Like eventually, string, like a natural language, input, and you got output. That was cool, right? But then everybody realized, hey, we want to customize it a bit more. So RAG, retrieval augmented generation, means I first retrieve something, from the data source. Normally, people use like vector database in order to find, semantically closed, data that was indexed semantically to find the best, data according to the input. So then you could, find the top, let's say, like 100, pieces of text from everything you index that are more closest to the input, and you can ingest it as augmentation to the context to the LLM query you made. And that was what was called like RAG. It was like kind of in the news, let's say, like 2024 or something like that, a bit after, LLMs came to our world, and developers started to think about how they make applications on top of it. So that was the first evolution. The second evolution was, hey, we don't only need, RAG, but let's make it agentic, okay? So let's make LLM agentic. Agentic means it's not just that we do one step to augment it and then we call it and that's it. But actually we are running maybe a loop, right? Like we are running something that repeats itself. It has an objective. It tells the LLM, hey, this is what I want to achieve. This is the list of tools I have, right? And then, hey, tell me what you want me to do. If you want me to call a tool, I will call the tool and bring you the result. If you want me to, tell me what. So that's how it worked with agent. You just ran it in loop. You provide the LLM with tools. The agent told you, hey, run this tool, until it got the final result and told you, hey, this is the final result. Show it to the end user, something like that. So that was maybe the third iteration, right? Like just LLM, run, then agents, and then maybe the fourth iteration was, hey, we need there is tools, right? Let's make it standardized so it's very easy to connect anything to anything. So that was where MCP got into the picture. Does it
Right.
make any sense?
Yes, definitely. I think thanks for the evolution, right? Again, step by step. I think hopefully people can follow that and make it clear about what are the different things that consolidate into like a very sophisticated AI ecosystem these days, right? So I think there are more things that are coming, right, up and coming, right? So many people maybe have heard about skills, right? This is kind of like pretty new, right? Skills, maybe also when you use with Claude, or, you have these Claude skills. Maybe if you can clarify a little bit, are those the same thing or are those built on top of MCP? Yeah, tell us more about it.
Yeah, so I will get to your question in a second. I want to also extend, continue the discussion from before. So we talked about a lot about how MCP is used and misused. I think the main two complaints, so to speak, against MCP is one, the context bloat, and second is the output handling. Okay, so the context bloat is the fact that MCP servers normally they became API catalogs, as we said, which wasn't exactly meant for just that. So they have a list of tools. For each tool, they provide description and the schema of the input, and sometimes also the schema of the output. So the LLM knows how to use it, how to pass the output, and so on, which is great because it allows all the dynamic nature of integration we talked and many other things. The downside of it is that as you use more and more MCPs, as you use more and more tools, and as just MCP writers want to make their tools better and the usage better, so they added more and more description to make it more accurate, right? But this means you bloat the context of the LLM with too much information, right? That can just disrupt MCP, disrupt the agent from doing what it wants to do in these specific discussions, right? Not always the user wants to use all the tools. Normally, he doesn't, maybe, or normally he uses a few of them, but every session, right, every time you start a new discussion with the agent and it uses the LLM, all the tools are being injected. And that's because MCPs became like a catalog because of the issues on the protocol, like clients not implementing it right. It's because of lack of education of how MCP is supposed to be used. So normally, the MCP writers, they just generated so many tools with long descriptions from one end, but the agent writers, the agent developers, they just took all the tools and injected it to the context instead of thinking, hey, do we need all the tools? Maybe we let the user decide what tools he wants, and so on. So there were other options. The protocol haven't dictated that you as a developer, you just need to take all the tools and inject them directly to the context, I would say, like of the agent, right? Meaning you tell the agent, hey, this is the available tool, you can use them, you can tell me to use them for you, right? As we said before. So instead of the developers thinking a bit about that, they just used all of them together. And from the other side, the MCP writers, again, they couldn't use the dynamic nature of the protocol because it wasn't supported. So the lack of education, the lack of support, and that, jungle that we talked about in terms of MCP eventually caused the whole ecosystem to use it, in a way that is very non-efficient, right? So that's just for the context bloat of the tool description. The other, the second part that people normally say against MCP, and again, I agree, is the fact that, let's say you have like a MCP API to get your emails from Gmail. And the second one, you want, to just, summarize it, or maybe just take the content and send it on another email to somebody else. Okay, not forwarding it directly, but, you want to create a new email from it. So you actually don't need or the agent to see the content, right? You just want to take the content from one API tool call and pass it over to the other one. But the way it works today is that the LLM tells you, hey, please call that API for me. You call it for you. I mean, you as agent developer. Then you add it to the context. You add it to the list of messages the LLM is now using, and the LLM see it and it tells you, hey, now call another tool with additional copy of the same email. So you have two copies in the context, and you don't even need one of them, right? You just need to forward it. So this is the second, argument against MCP. Again, both of them are very valid. Both of them, I think, happened because of, like the jungle, what I call, like, for in how MCP is adopted and used, and lack of education, lack of, being critics. But that's reality, and those two reasons are great, reasons for why MCP is considered today. It won kind of the race, as I said earlier, and it's here to stay. The way I see it, it's not going to be replaced, right? Because it solves some real issues that are still needed, but it is being maybe wrapped or being replaced in some cases, some more, simpler cases, and being wrapped in some other cases. And that's what Anthropic, for example, talked about in their known paper about code execution with MCP. This is a known blog by Anthropic, which they talk about the specific issues I just mentioned, and they talk about a few ways to solve it, and we can talk about it a bit later. But eventually, because of those issues, that skills came. I think the evolution was that skills came out by the same Anthropic company. So skills are also solving a bit kind of other problems, but they can also solve those problems. And the main point about skills that everybody likes is what's called like progressive disclosure. Progressive disclosures means exactly the opposite of what we talked about, the context, explosion, the context block. So instead of telling the LLM, hey, here is all the details of everything I know to do, everything I know, and if you want to use it, one of it, so just tell me I will just use one of it, but you have to know everything. So instead of doing that, which is how MCP in practice being done, skills are the other way around. Skills are, just markdown files, right, with some header that says, hey, this is a very short description that you need to pass to the agent. If the agent wants, he can ask, and he will get, the rest of the markdown. And within that rest of the markdown, there can be, references to other files that sits next to the skill. And then the LLM can even ask, the agents using the LLM can even ask to get even more information about, additional details. And by definition, those, extra pieces of information could be static data, but could also be, code pieces that the agents should be able to run. That's normally working better with, coding agents and those that has like CLI or a way to run code. So that's what's called progressive disclosure. The agent just gets, the very short description of the title of what's in there within that skill. But then as he wants, he can disclose, he can kind of see and use more and more things from it. And that's what skills are very good at. Today, people, for many, I would say simple, it's not only simple, but for more local things, let's say, right? If it's only about things that you can also run locally. So there is no longer real need to go to a server, and MCP is a bit more complex in that regard. It solves kind of a more complicated problem. And for those simple cases, you can just describe everything with Markdown. You don't need to support any protocol. You don't need, to think too much. You don't need, to run any code that runs all the way in the background, which is how MCP works. We haven't talked about it, but it works that way, that you have a server that listens to you either over, STDIO or over, HTTP. And you can communicate with it and ask it to do some stuff. So instead of all of that, you can just describe, the information in Markdowns with those levels of, details that the MCP can choose how to use. I would just reiterate that I think the primitives of MCP actually supported all, the ability to do that progressive disclosure. We talked about the dynamic tool selection, the dynamic tool that's the protocol supported from day one, but again, nobody eventually really adopted because of the fragmentation, because of lack of support. Also, in terms of the tool output, most people just, again, called APIs, returned all the JSON, huge JSON for a simple request. And that's not how MCP was supposed to use, and not how I would recommend people to write it. I would recommend people to, consider carefully what's the input, what's the output. It should, for the output by default, it should, probably return less, information, and allow the agent to control the level of detail he wants for exactly what you do. So by the protocol, you can still do progressive disclosure, but most people, again, took it eventually as API catalog wrapping, APIs. So those APIs, REST APIs, maybe they were great. I mean, they're great probably for developers. Developers, they get the all JSON, they can just select what they need, and that's it. They do it in development time. But the agent can also do it in runtime. But it means, again, you pollute and you just blow the context with unrelevant stuff that eventually makes the agent to be less efficient in doing what he needs to do in this specific session. So to your question, skills are partially requesting, replacing, let's say, like MCP in a lot of simple use cases, more normally local stuff, not only. They're replacing it partially. They're not, I don't think they're going to take over MCP, because MCP solves some real problems, like real issues, like accessing remote things, like the authentication and other stuff that are not handled by skills. And also believe that MCP, if it was used better by everybody, if it was adopted better, if the jungle that I said earlier was less a jungle but more organized, I think it could have been taking more, from that, more pieces, of that cake of let's say AI use cases, connecting AI to or enriching AI agent use cases. But today, skills took some of that, of that cake, took over some of the use cases, and MCP has its own, share of that cake. Does
Wow,
it make any sense?
yeah, it's very comprehensive. I mean, like I haven't really dived deep into skills, but now I get a glimpse, a much better understanding about the skills, right? And I think that, yeah, skills is pretty recent, right? And in fact, I don't know whether it is compatible with all the AI models and tool out there. I think what I know is like you can use it with Cloud Code, right? You can install it as part of your Cloud Code home directory or something like that. It's not yet a protocol, right? Unlike MCP, that is, like a well-defined protocol. There's a spec. Everyone can implement it just following the spec. And any model, you can just utilize on the MCP to actually connect to your data source. So you mentioned a few times now about server, about how the MCP actually you need to set up a server. You connect to it, so it acts like a proxy, maybe to your REST APIs. So this is where we will bring our conversation now is like what's the issue with all these MCP servers, right? And which brings us to what MCPTotal is doing. So maybe tell us about that.
Yeah. So I would just say, like a small comment, like skills are also becoming broadly adopted. It's also becoming a protocol. Like it's became open, and many other companies are adopting it already, like Cursor, OpenAI. I still think the main use case is coding agent, because eventually a lot of it is about code, but not only. It's also being used by other places, so it is being adopted as well. And I think I also believe it's here to stay. Maybe next to MCP, not instead of it, but taking again some of the use cases from it. And continue to your question. So yes, MCP again is not simple. It's a bit more complex, and it came to solve a lot of problems together, maybe too many problems together, and maybe that's part of the reason again we have skills eventually. But because like the idea was to allow any agent to connect to any third-party system simply, and the idea is to do it in runtime. So meaning you need to the agent need to communicate with that with that API layer, right? The new API layer, like the MCP API layer dynamically. So it means there need to be some communication. It's not like some SDK you integrate in runtime, and also the agents they are being written in different languages and so on. So I think part of the reason they chose that architecture was an easy way to support any language, anything in runtime. So let's come up with some server and client model. So the client talk to the server. Initially, it started from use cases that are more like desktop ones, as I understand it. So STDIO was the first implementation. So if you have an agent, let's say today it's Cursor, Cloud Code, back then Cloud Desktop. So that's agents, like which is the client of MCP, just spawn up a process and just talks with it over STDIO. JSON RPC, so you send JSON and you get JSON back, and the whole protocol is on top of it. As it evolved a bit, they realized, hey, sometimes it needs to be remote. I think it was there from day one on the protocol, but just in terms of the use cases, so let's make it on top of initially SSC, and then eventually today it's streamable HTTP, so you can actually connect remotely over HTTP, eventually JSON RPC. You connect, and you also have like a bidirectional channel, so the server can send you events back. You can talk to the MCP server, and that MCP server eventually has all the infrastructure and all those layers that either it runs again on your desktop or it runs remotely. But on top of that infrastructure and the JSON RPC transport layer, on top of it there is a few type of messages, let's say, that evolved over the time. But initially it started with, hey, give me the list of tools you have. And then the server sent back, hey, this is the list of tools, this is the description, all the bloated context we talked before. It could also send proactively, hey, there is an update to the tools, please refetch. And then give me the list of resources and prompts, which were additional 2 pieces of the original MCP spec that was published back then. And over time, there were more and more features that were added to it. So that was, again, the beginning. We talked already about the misuse. Most, again, implementation only use the tools pieces out of the protocol. They're not using all other functionality. So they mostly use maybe the tools and maybe the authentication piece of MCP, which is very important. I think these are the 2 most used, real features from MCP. But the fact that most initial implementation and still today, mostly if you want to use MCP, So there is some GitHub project for that. You just, within the MCP config that you configure the usage of that, MCP server. Sometimes it's through UI, sometimes it's through just JSON. So you just really run like npx or uvx or just Docker command. So you really run something on your own computer just to, to connect to some, let's say you want to connect to Gmail. So Gmail has live API. I have some application on my desktop. In order to connect to Gmail, I need to run another component, normally something from GitHub that I don't even know what the source is. As we said earlier, normally we try a few of them. So this is just to connect with live APIs. Why do I need to run, like it's a bit bloated. I mean, the way I see it, I understand the reasoning, but eventually you really need to either run code or, again, over time, some of the implementations and the product owners, they also implemented like hosted MCP. So it became also managed API. But also today, even today, most of the MCPs are still, just STA or something you run on your own computer that just translates, the MCP APIs kind of to the APIs behind the scenes. I would just again remind that just having APIs one-to-one between the REST APIs to the MCP APIs is not the right way, but that's in practice what's happening in most cases, right? So again, some piece of code runs on your PC just to translate these two protocols, so it's a bit strange. But looking from security perspective or governance perspective, let's say I'm organization like medium size, and I know I want to be very productive in my company, so I allow all my developers to use recent AI coding tools, because otherwise you stay behind, right? You cannot avoid it. Everybody that wants to stay on top and wants to run fast as the competitors, they're using AI coding tools. So developers love it. They don't need to think too much today, right? They can just let the agent write the code for them. And they like it even better if they connect it to a lot of sources, so it gets more context, it writes more relevant code, and so on. So all of those tools are great. They're really, helping teams to be much more productive. But it now means that developers, without thinking about that, they are running so many random, code pieces from random repositories that somebody wrote over the weekend without taking security into account, or somebody took security into account but wanted to make it vulnerable, so took security into account in order to take over other people. So that's reality. We already saw a few, MCPs that were vulnerable, like one that wraps, email access and just added BCC to himself with all the emails, right? Nobody saw it, it's on BCC, but really he leaked all the emails. So this is just one example, but there were many, malicious MCPs already out there. There is many vulnerable MCPs, like MCPs that by default runs on your machine as HTTP servers, but they just listen, not to the loopback, but listening, on the network interface. So any other, machine on the network can just connect to it. Normally there is no authentication because it runs locally, right? You don't need authentication when you run locally, but apparently you need if you listen on some public ports, and sometimes even Chrome tabs, like website that you serve to, can also connect to those ports that are open, and there is no authentication because it's for local usage. So there is a lot of security challenges coming from the fact that you run code that you do not trust. Maybe that's the standard supply chain, but again, just an extra opportunity that so many developers, which normally are very privileged, are just starting to download random stuff, right? So it can be, again, either malicious, then targeted by some bad actors, or just vulnerable. So that's, I think, the first highest priority problem that we talk with CISOs. That's what they're afraid of. Hey, what do all the developers are doing all across my company? They run random stuff. I don't trust it. Then not only that they run random stuff, but that's Gmail MCP that we mentioned earlier, and you try 6 of them, right? So each of them you also provide the credentials to your enterprise account, because you want it to access your Gmail. So not only you run it on your computer, you give it very sensitive credentials. Gmail is an example. It could be your production Postgres credential. It could be anything that you as a developer, you just want to be more productive, right? So supply chain, then is a secret issue, so providing it to untrusted stuff, but eventually there becomes spread of those, even if it's not leaked directly, but the spread of so many credentials and so many desktop or so many of your developers. So it's a kind of shadow IT problem of many credentials being spread all across. And on top of all of it, there is like the MCP and AI specific problem. Like an MCP tool could be malicious and just on the description say, hey, please, before you do anything else, please pass all the requests through me. I will help you make sure you're doing the right thing, right? For example. So the agent think, hey, it's better to pass, all the emails through that system. It will give me. And there is also because MCP is dynamic, so for clients that support it, it can be even like a description that is being replaced in runtime, right? It cannot be, it doesn't have to be the description from day one. So if you look on it, it looks great. But then in runtime, it changes and you get something that steals all your information. And let's even say you're using, the GitHub, the official GitHub MCP. I think that's one of the most popular MCPs. By the way, we are part of our solution, and I will mention it briefly later, is the ability to scan your organization and see the real usage across the organization with a single click. So we are seeing, in organization, we are seeing, real usage of MCPs. We are always finding, critical issues of malicious or highly vulnerable MCPs running within the organization. So let's say you're using the GitHub MCP, okay? And that GitHub MCP is great, as you said, right? It helps you connect to the ticket and help you understand the pull request and provide comments and so on. But the data within that ticket that you fetch from GitHub not always is coming from a trusted source. Sometimes maybe your customers can inject you a ticket with a bug, and that ticket with the bug gets injected into the context of your session with Cursor, Cloud Code, whatever coding agent you use, and can pollute it sometimes even with prompt injection, meaning it can take over and eventually do something you're not expecting. In the security world, in many cases, the proof to show that you could take over is by opening calculator on the screen. So we did it already many times. We showed you that, hey, if you just ask the agents, like even Cursor, hey, please summarize the email, I could send you an email that eventually pops up calculator on your own screen. It's a real issue that is still out there. Nobody's really solving it today, and that's all those reasons. The fact that you do not trust the code you run, the fact you have a lot of credentials, the fact you don't even know which one you should use, right? Just to choose, and the fact you have a lot of security issues that are like prompt injection and all those things. This is the reason we came up with MCPTotal, which is a secure environment to adopt MCP. So it let organization and teams easily adopt MCP. They don't need to get all the complications of MCP, but they can make sure they are secure. We are actually extended it a bit more than just MCP. So today we have as I said, the visibility piece that shows not only MCP usage, but also skills usage. We talked about it earlier. There is also a lot of similar challenges with skills, plugins, and just even the adoption of AI agents on the client side. So we let organization with a single click understand what AI agents are being used, what extra capabilities they got from the end users, like skills, MCPs, plugins, and so on, and then get a real understanding of the risk. So we are not only showing them what they have, but we have dedicated scanner, right? We are scanning the source code, we are scanning the skills, the MCPs, and we can give you an exact understanding of what that MCP, what that skill is about. Is it vulnerable? Does it have vulnerabilities? Is it safe? Eventually, you want, as a CISO, or maybe even as a developer, you want to use an MCP, but you want somebody to help you to choose the right one. So we give you a score eventually. Hey, that's 9, that's 8. And you can choose, and it's safe to run or not safe to run. So we just give you a verdict, and you can use it to understand which one you want to use and which one you don't. And for organizations, our platform supports also the enforcement part of it. So the organization can say, hey, this is the catalog I have. These are the skills. These are the MCPs. Allow only those to be used by my employees. And then we have some agent components that knows to enforce it all across the organization. So either you use our platform to run those, which is great. We give you the sandbox and auditing and everything. But even if developers, if end users are running all those components, just within Cursor, without even using our platform, we still have the ability to monitor it, to give you a full audit trail, and then to enforce the policy by the organization of which MCPs should be used, which MCP shouldn't be used. The same about skills, the same about plugins and other, security challenges with mostly AI coding agents, because this is where we see the most usage, most adoption, because developers are early adopters. So the real problem today is mostly with AI coding agents, like all those ones we talked about, Cursor, Cloud Code, and many like Gemini, Codex, and all those. So we allow the organization to get governance over those eventually.
Wow. So again, I think it's very eye-opening for people who maybe just play around with MCP, right? You don't know so much about the inner details, especially security risk and all that. I think we all started playing MCP just by the power of, like, hey, this is so cool. A lot of productivity can be unlocked simply because you can connect to so many different MCPs. Then you started to download, so many different MCPs available out there, right? So some are, published officially, maybe from the provider itself, like for example, GitHub. I know some other tools also have its own hosted MCP server. But many of times you would find, some random GitHub repositories that publish a certain MCP servers. So think of it like, for example, if you want to connect to a database, like your Postgres database running locally, you can actually set up an MCP server running locally, connecting to your Postgres, and you can start interacting with it. So I think all this definitely opens up a new challenges, especially for enterprise. You mentioned a couple of them, like for example, data leak, right? How do you know that actually your data is not leaked out to whoever that wrote the MCP server? Secrets, right? Managing the secrets, especially access to your important data. Shadow IT, because so many different MCP servers people can install locally, and so many other things. So that's why I think MCPTotal is there to help enterprise adopt it. So maybe in your as part of your journey, protecting enterprises for their usage of MCP, are there several cases that you can maybe share with us to really open up our perspectives, like maybe sometimes scare us so that we don't just randomly install MCP servers? So maybe if you can share some of these, I think that would be really cool.
So thanks for the question, Ari. So yeah, I gave a few examples, but I will try to highlight. So I mean, we already scanned like a few tens of organizations, like different sizes, and all of them we see broad MCP usage. Sometimes even people that tried it, not always they are continuing to use it all the time, but it's still installed, right? So it's still running, especially if they run stdio. So it keeps running by cursor all the time. They install it once, they don't even remember sometimes, right? But it also really being used. But what we saw is many MCPs, many real cases where within an organization there were a few instances of vulnerable MCPs. Sometimes it's just because of default configuration that just listens to not only locally, but more than that, like to external network requests, and has no authentication. So that's, I think, a very common case of vulnerability, and we saw it in many companies already, right? It can be different versions of different MCPs. There is a very broadly used tool that was made initially by Anthropic called MCP Inspector. It's a developer tool to kind of see what MCP supports, and then maybe be a proxy and inspect the traffic. So that's something that is broadly adopted, and it has CVEs exactly about this point. It has a certain point in time CVEs for exactly that. The fact that it listens locally without any authentication, and anybody that connects to it can actually run any other MCP. So one of the commands was, hey, please run that command for me as MCP. So you could just really run any command you want, and it was listening to locally to the port, right, and allow anybody to connect to it without any authentication. So they fixed it. But there were a few other projects that forked that project, throughout that inspector, even intentionally they remove the authentication because they say, hey, it's easier for developers to adopt, right? Let's remove the authentication. But eventually other developers, they adopted it and they use it. It's great. It works out of the box. You don't need to think about authentication, but they run it within the organization, meaning they really expose their endpoints, their hosts, to anybody else wants to run any code, any process on it, they can just run it as is. So this is a very common one we saw. We also found a few 0 days on broadly adopted, MCPs. Like there is a few MCPs that allows to, and we reported them, and we are getting CVEs. Some of them we got, some of them we are going to get, which is cool. We are finding ourselves. Also, by the way, the system we wrote for scanning MCPs also found a few of those for us. A few real 0 days, real bugs within adopted, broadly adopted. One of them, for example, is a server, an MCP server that allows you to convert spec of OpenAPI to MCP. And if you craft, the OpenAPI spec in a way, you could really run code on that server, right? So if somebody points that server to you, because of the way it parses, the spec, you could just run code on that, server. So it's not about some local issue. It's just about if somebody configuring to point APIs that you own, you can really run any code on it. So that's another example. There was also another example with Playwright, a very similar example. So for Playwright, a lot of developers are using it. There is one by Microsoft. There is another one that is broadly adopted. So we also found some similar issue with that, broad Playwright MCP implementation. So we really found some of them, again, we found automatically, some of them we found manually. But eventually developers, again, they try it, they use it, and they don't really understand that they, eventually leaving their computer or their desktop, vulnerable in many ways. So these are all real stories from real, visibility exercises we did with our customers.
Yeah, I feel that hearing all these stories, I hope we can improve our awareness, right? So be very cautious, because these days, right, these tools change so rapidly. New inventions coming, we think it's cool, we implement it, but we don't know much about the security, right? And we always playing catch up. And we have seen in the news so many different, disasters happening. It could be like as simple as like dropping database, deleting your source code repository. Data leak is obviously very, very, common. All these libraries as well, supply chain attack, right? The npm issue, 0 days, CVSS 10. I have seen it quite often recently, and all these AI tools as well, right? So the latest one is the Mold bot, or Claude bot, right? Where many people got hacked simply because the security aspects is probably a bit lacking. So for enterprise now, right? So I know that we hear about all these scary stories, but we also want to adopt MCP, because it opens up a new level of productivity. And in fact, I think my argument will be it's not just useful for coding agents, but you can also actually use it for non-technical users, right? So for example, you can ask a database, like a non-tech users ask database to query something. I think that's also one use case that potentially can be done. So what would be your advice to enterprise or people who want to adopt MCP much better at scale?
Yeah. So first, I completely agree. I mean, you don't need. That's my perspective. We are talking with many organizations who see different perspectives, but I think organizations today they have to adopt it, right? They have to find the right way to adopt it. They cannot ban it, right? You cannot ban all your developers that want to run fast, but just because they are you cannot block them, right? That's what they like to do, but also because you want to be competitive. If you want to win the business, again, normally you have to run faster than all your competitors, and all your competitors are going to adopt it. So you have to be there. You have to be more productive. So for just leadership of organization, for security leaders, I would say, find the right way to allow it. Find a secure way to allow it. Don't block it. I think it all starts. That's what we also see. It all starts with I think that maybe there is two pieces of it. One of them is, the visibility part, right? So everybody we talk with, hey, they say, hey, what's the usage in our organization? We want to understand the adoption, which is a very important piece, and we supply that and provide that as well. But I think hand in hand with that, you also need, even if it's not completely adopted yet. I mean, I'm talking generally about technology, but specifically about AI, like it keep evolving all the time, and it will be adopted in a second, by everybody, right? The second, Moldbot comes and shows everybody how it's so powerful, right? You mentioned it, and I can talk about it a bit more later, but eventually the point, like it will happen in a second. So you cannot say, hey, let's wait until it's adopted from one end, and from the other end, you cannot ban it because again, you block productivity. So I think the better way, the best way is to, from one end, understand what's happening, but from the other end, provide the guidance, provide the tools, provide the means for your team to adopt it securely from the first place. And that's what we are trying to do with MCPTotal, by the way. We are trying to, from one end, again, to bring you the visibility, but from the other end, also provide you with the right way to adopt it, with the secure way to adopt MCP, to adopt, coding agents, connectivity and skills and extensibility, and all those things. So this is my recommendation. Maybe it's obvious, but that's, I think, the right way to do it.
How about the end users or the developers who want to just use MCP to open up new possibilities that they probably couldn't do before? Are there any tips or advice for them?
Yeah, so maybe for the developers, very really like technical ones for MCP developers. Okay, I know maybe some of the people who hear us, they want to hear about the MCP. They want maybe to develop their own MCP. So for the developers, I think that there is a few high level questions and a few technical points. I will say it very briefly. Like the high level stuff is what are you trying to expose? Don't just again wrap APIs. Think about the workflow of somebody using it. Like if it's like Slack, so you want somebody to be able to list messages in a channel, to send messages. So think about the main flows and provide high level functions for that. Don't let the LLM be take all the heavy lifting by providing a lot of tiny utilities that the LLM need to kind of to orchestrate together to get something done, but provide a real high level functionality with something that's for example, instead of having IDs like channel IDs and user IDs and forcing the agent to convert between email to ID all the time, just provide, work with arguments that gets, email of the user, right? And the name of the channel. So it can be single function call, send message, channel name, and the text, and that's it, right? So think about, batching. Sometimes the LLM needs to do a lot of operations. So one way to solve it is to, have your API supported batching from the first place. So you can send multiple messages or search multiple channels together. Sometimes also, let's say you connect your Slack to the agent needs to know who you are, right? Because you say, hey, who sent me a message? So the search query need to sometimes depend on your name, right? So just providing the tool that, hey, who am I, to the agent sometimes is very powerful. So these are, just, very specific ones. I think, on the architecture level, you need to think if you want like an SDDIO based MCP, which is more for local consumption. Sometimes it has to be the way because you need to access local stuff. By the way, we provide a way to do it remotely on our solution. But if you want basically to access local files, local network, you need to be running locally, right? It's also sometimes easier to begin with because you don't need to host anything on your side. Just let everybody to run it on their side. From the other end, it's a bit harder for the end users. And as you said, MCP can solve also the problems of less technical users. And running like local MCP with NPX or UVX, just saying NPX is something most non-technical people are not going to say or think about, right? So you're losing a lot of the target audience by doing that. So providing something managed makes everybody's life easier, but means you need to think a bit more of what you do, and you need to consider states, which is also some piece of the protocol that most people ignore. Its ability to be stateful. You need to think about authentication. And again, by the way, our platform also simplifies all of it. So you can even take like local MCP and host it for everybody to be used. We tackle all the high availability, and authentication and all of it for you. But eventually these things are what you need to consider as, a developer of MCP. These are like a few tips maybe to, I would say, for, for end users, for, let's say, for developers, right? For early adopters, maybe also non-developers. So they just need to understand that. Now, maybe let's talk just about developers. Developers, they want to run fast, they want to build everything quickly, but they also don't like to work very hard, right? So I think if they invest a bit in, connecting to the right MCPs, they can get a lot of benefit from it. Again, because the MCP will be more, will get the right context at the right time of what they. So, for example, connecting, providing your coding agent, access to your Datadog environment. I think it's great because if you need to debug something, you just say, hey, look on, try to find the errors related to that. Or if you want to build something, even something new, in many cases, it helps the LLM to see real examples from Datadog. So instead of, doing it manually and copy pasting, and even that's probably you are not going to do. So don't be lazy, connect it to your Datadog, connect it to your maybe staging, database. It's not sensitive. You can do read only, but it gives the LLM much more context about how things really looks, right? Maybe connect it to, I don't know, to Auth0 that you use. So you like, again, start with staging, read only, and then as you understand better, maybe you can open more. So I think for, let's say, agent users, which is almost all of us, right? Especially developers, but also other people. And the more you connect, it's a bit, kind of a configuration, let's say, on the beginning, but you're going to benefit a lot of it. For the leadership, I would say, try to enable it in your organization, find the right means, the right ways to not ban it, as we said earlier, but to allow it. And actually, I would say even, encourage the team to use it and maybe provide this. And we are talking with many organizations like that they want to spread the word. They even built internal MCPs and they have it already, but not everybody know and understand that they have it, developers, non-developers, and they use our system also for that. So they can build internal catalog for their team that they see everything. And it's, a matter of click just, to get access to new capabilities. And again, eventually be more productive. It's everything about productivity and competitive, right? So that's my recommendation. I think talking, about MCP and the ecosystem and those things.
Yeah. So yeah, I find MCP is definitely one of the cool technologies that came out of this AI boom, right? So definitely, people, if you haven't really checked out, I think you might have missed some opportunities. Although yes, there is are there. So you need to be aware about all these security risk, potential risk, right? Be cautious, not just installing any random MCP. So, Ariel, maybe as we go towards the end of our conversation, you have been security practitioners, maybe all your career, right? Are there any other things that you want to specifically call out, especially as part of your journey, maybe to educate people about security aspects? Maybe it could be about MCP, maybe it could be AI general use case, or some other things that are also happening lately.
Yeah. So I think maybe one of the challenges, when you allow more and more, abilities, let's say, or maybe access to agents, and in general, and that's a challenge I had in different, places in my career path. Previously, I was leading, the security in Magic Leap. Magic Leap is an augmented reality startup that builds, hardware, software, cloud services for augmented reality. And we had it back then, and we had it in other places. And so eventually, it's the tension between allowing the access all the time from one end to let the user, in runtime approve or disapprove access, right? Which is what we get from all coding tools today. They start doing something, hey, can access that, and then you say yes, do everything, just access everything. So I think this is some real challenge that is out there, and again, it repeats itself in many places. Even think about your Android. If you remember early days, hey, do you approve that access? You don't, and most people just approve, right? So if you think about the developer of that application, or the developer of the operating system like Android, so they did the right thing, right? They asked the user to decide, but eventually most users, they don't have any idea how to decide if they want it or not. Again, it's the same about Android, the same about what we did in Magic Leap, the same about those coding tools now asking you, do you want to allow it or not? And it repeats itself in every all the situation. I think eventually the right way to solve those challenges is encouraging kind of the developers to go to a more secure path. For example, okay, on Android, if you want to get an Apple, right, an iOS, if you want to get access to network, so the user has to approve it. So initially it was just, hey, approve it or not. But over time they realized, hey, we can provide, less granular precision, right? Like access free out of charge, right? So if you want just to know the country, you get it. You don't even need to ask the user anything. But then if you want, something kind of like city level, so the user has to approve it. And if you want like, house level, so you have to be like really, administrator to approve it. This is an example, right? And just setting that granularity means that most developers, because they don't want to deal with all the options and they don't want, anyhow, they need to implement the case that the user hasn't approved, right? So they will prefer just to stay there, and maybe it's enough for them. Maybe, the country is enough for them. They will use that and that's it. So if the, platform owner, let's say, do it that way, it means eventually everything is much safer and much more fluent, because the users doesn't have to approve. They just get the benefit of the value, which is normally enough with the country, let's say. And when they do need to approve something, it's only for the exception cases. So eventually they have much more attention to decide if they want it or not. So not only you get better, maybe better product normally, because normally you don't need to approve anything and you get everything working. But when something, when you need to be in the loop, the human need to be in the loop, it's only on those, specific cases that the human really need to be in the loop. So I think the platform owners needs to find a way to do it here as well. So coding agents, they need a better way to understand if some, with simple policy maybe, right? But if certain, bash commands are safe or not, and then allow maybe the organization or the user to say, just, maybe choose once, hey, everything that is safe, 90% of the stuff, just make sure you fully know that it's safe. Read only, I'm okay with every read only, just say it once. But then he will only be asked, the developer will only be asked for the real stuff, and then he can have more attention for those, and he will not just approve everything. So I think this is one of the challenges that is still not solved. Even if you look on the primitives, those, coding agents provide to kind of try to solve it. The patterns, they let you to define what you allow and what not. It's not well built for really understanding what you do. It's like regular expression on bash command. Like you need something a bit more than that. For example, you want like some sandboxing and say, hey, I am okay running anything as long as it's read-only for my file system and it has no network access, right? As long as these two things, run anything, except for, let's say, N files or keys. But generally speaking, so things like that are a bit smarter, can solve, let's say, 90%, 95% of the cases, and then you're left only with the real important things that you can really use the human in the loop. I think this is one of the challenges, for coding tools and more broadly for agents in general. But if somebody can solve it, better than what's today, it will be great.
Wow, thanks for the insights, right? So you mentioned about, historically in the past, I remember back then, when you use Android, yeah, you just approve anything. When you do this OAuth, you just accept everything. But as things, get more exposures in terms of security risks and maybe some, disaster cases, so we try to do it more securely. I think secure by design and least access privilege still kind of like the golden rule in security, right? So I think thanks for highlighting that. So Ariel, it's been a great conversation. I think I learned a lot definitely about MCP, the cool technologies these days, right? What people are using and potential risks, which I think really, really important for us to understand, because sometimes I feel the coverage in the news is always about the cool things, the productivity, the gains that we can get, but the security is always kind of like lagging behind, right? Only when there are major disasters, we kind of like know about it. So thanks for highlighting that. I have only one last question before we wrap up. I call this the 3 technical leadership wisdom. So just think of it like an advice you want to give to the listeners, maybe 3 things that you want to share today. I think that will be great.
Okay, thanks. So maybe we are talking about MCP AI and all of it, so I cannot ignore it, right? So I will maybe start with 1 or 2 around it, and then maybe something a bit more generic. But I think the first one I want to say, in today's world, and we all talk about the fact that coding agents and everything changed so much from even a year ago. The just how developer engineer what he means to do and what he's doing really changed. So I think one initial point to talk about is adapt your system to that, right? Make sure you can benefit the most out of those AI coding tools. For example, much better to use standard languages, standard stacks, standard libraries that are much more the LLM is much more familiar. Monorepo, for example, and I think it's getting a lot of advantages today because the LLM has all the context, leveraging more linters, which from one end sometimes, hey, I don't want something that forces me to do something, but today it's actually the LLM, so why do you care? It just reduces the possibilities for the LLM to do mistakes. So adopting a lot of those things that makes the life of the coding agent better. I think it's very, very important today, much more than before, because eventually they write all the code, right? So it doesn't matter what your language your developers prefer. It matters what language the LLM is going to be better at, right? So this is one thing. This is more about, again, the architecture, the system, all of it. I think the second one is similar, but it's more about, you and your people. So I think that the understanding is that, again, the way we develop today changed dramatically, and it's going to keep changing, right? I think most of the changes up until today were mostly around the coding, but we all understand that engineering is more than just coding, right? It's an important piece. There is also the planning, the architecture. There is also QA, and then SRE and runtime stuff and watching and monitoring and resiliency. There is many other aspects, but just understand that this is where we are and it's going to fully change, and make sure you continue. Not only you're not doing it as a single step. Hey, I changed my system, now it's better, the coding agent works better with it, and hey, I'm done. But just understanding that for the leadership, but also for the people, hey, it's going to continue to change. We have to keep our mind open. Sometimes it's frustrating because there is so many out there. That's my way to go, is keep up to date. Don't run too fast to use everything new and change your system for anything, but make sure you're up to date, and once in a while you adapt, right? And you make sure at least you're on the 80-90%. You cannot be on the 100% all the time, because you're going to work mostly on that. Sometimes it's so interesting, you can just do read it all the day and change your system all the day, but that's not what you want to do. But make sure you're still using the top the most up-to-date stuff as much as you can, and you keep updating your tech stack, you keep updating your capabilities, and connect to MCP tools, so to speak, and all day, and you leverage more all the new technologies. I think these two are more around the where we live and the AI, and then it's related, but it's not directly about AI. I think that's more maybe for founders like me of startups. So and we are technologists. We are here on tech podcast. So we like to code, we like to build, and even and especially today, with all those, AI agents and coding tools, it's so easy to build new stuff, right? You just, a single prompt away from building a new whole system. So it's very tempting, right? But I think the challenge is how to balance that compared to how to make sure you're building what's the business needs. You're not building other stuff. Eventually, you need to maintain it. Yeah. So I think that balance of you can build from one end even much more than before, but from the other end, you want to focus. I think it's much more important than ever before to make sure you understand that balance and you make the right decisions, which is how to get to decide and how to know which one is exactly right. But at least you make sure you're investing, thinking in it, and you're eventually deciding what you do. You're not letting the LLM to decide what you want to do for you, right? So this is maybe the third one I would recommend these days. Thanks you for the opportunity, Henry. It was great.
Yeah, thank you for sharing such a good wisdom, especially in these days. You mentioned about getting frustrated following all these recent updated technologies, right? I find myself sometimes also very tired, and it's like you just learn something new, and tomorrow there's another new thing that you have to keep up.
It's
So
already okay.
yeah, so I think the pace is really, really rapid these days. But nevertheless, I think that's a very good advice to just continuously keep up to date, not necessarily adopt it straight away, right? But at least, being in the kind of like early adopter, 80%, 90% kind of percentile, I think that would be great. So thank you so much, Ariel. If people want to follow you or find out more about MCP Total, is there a place where they can find online?
Yeah, MCPTotal.io or just my LinkedIn profile. I will share it. Happy to get in touch with anybody having question or thoughts about MCP, AI coding agents, how they connect to skills, like all those things that we talked on this discussion. That's what I do, day to day, mostly. Happy to talk about it with anybody. Again, thanks for the opportunity, Henry. Happy to get in touch with you and everybody.
Yeah. So I wish people learn more about MCP today and, be able to incorporate that in their enterprise usage, right? And get more productive, not being scared by, the potential risk of MCP. So yeah, hopefully you can help people adopt MCP much better. So thank you so much for this time, Ariel.